Hey guys, welcome back to a Study in Truth podcast. Join Drew Leonard and me as we talk about dealing with anger. So today we're talking about dealing with anger. Before we get into it, I've got Drew Leonard here with me. He is an instructor at the Tri-City School of Preaching. He also preaches at the Cherokee Church of Christ in Johnson City. Actually, it's the place where I obeyed the gospel and went there for, I think, about 3 years. Drew, thank you for being on the podcast with me.
Oh, thanks for having me. Always enjoy seeing you and your wife, and it's a good time.
Yeah, before we start, just tell us a little bit about your website and your books. I know you just put out a book.
Okay. My website is CAD Leonard, LEONARD.com. And it's got some articles on there. Most of the stuff is free. And so there are some videos, there are some worksheets, there are some articles. And then if you're interested in books and you don't want to pay for them, you can always send me an email at drewleonard@live.com. And you can find that on the website as well, just an email address. And send me an email and ask for the PDFs for free. But also there is a tab there that has some books on it where you can actually order them in print if you're interested. The latest book I just did is it's a thing on 2 Corinthians, and I actually, in spite of the fact that I think most people aren't interested in it, I think it's one of my best, if not my best writing. It's written in a very practical and approachable way, while also there are footnotes at the bottom that kind of have some of that academic taste, if that's your interest.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, like how many people actually do read the footnotes? I'm just kidding. No, I do, because I like to know, hey, where did you get this from? So, so go and check out his website. Be sure to read. I know I've enjoyed his readings very, very much. So today we're talking about dealing with anger. Basically, the purpose of this episode is not really about anger being sinful or dealing with it in a bad way being sinful. I mean, a lot of sermons are done about that. Everybody knows it's sinful. Everybody wants to know how to deal with it. What do I do when I'm angry? What do I do when I feel like punching a hole in the wall or whatever it may be? How do I actually put it into application? But first, anger in of itself is not wrong. A lot of people may think that just getting angry and feeling mad is wrong. But we need to understand that, first of all, anger is a part of God's nature. God, throughout the text of the Bible, gets angry at things. I think about the Exodus account, Numbers. God looks at them doing something wrong, whatever it may be, whether it's picking up sticks on the Sabbath, whether it's complaining. God looks at them with burning anger and feels, not hatred, but anger towards them. And so anger isn't wrong because it flows from God's nature. And another thing is that we're actually commanded to be angry, aren't we, Drew? There's times we are.
That's exactly right. And Ephesians 4:26 says, be angry, but don't sin about it. And so obviously there's some sense if God is angry, and the text is even saying there's a sense in which we should be angry. It's obviously right in some cases. What we need to weigh then is which times is it appropriate, as said over against which times would it be considered inappropriate.
Yeah. And I would say in this case, being an appropriate time is when it's over sin. You know, I mean, if you're not angry at the atrocities in this nation right now, like abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, if that doesn't make you angry, something's wrong.
And I might weigh in there and say this as well. I think it's a severe tragedy when we get more upset because of a referee's call in a sporting event than we would get over, like you just mentioned, abortion or some of these other heinous atrocities. When we're more upset about that, we need to actually self-reflect and say, why am I being angry over things that would be considered more trivial, whereas the more important things of life, those atrocities don't really upset me as bad, as long as I get what suits me just fine.
Yeah. I was actually listening to a lesson by Don Blackwell a couple of years ago at PTP. He was talking about how a lot of elderly people are getting mad about their Social Security and not mad over abortion. And he says something's wrong. But we actually are commanded to be angry. But the kind of anger that God condemns is uncontrolled anger. I mean, we could be angry and should be angry over sin, but we could also deal with that in a negative sense. And if we're angry at someone else over something that doesn't matter, we could deal with that in a wrong way. And that's the kind of anger I want to talk about in this episode. Anger that is over something that's not sinful, or it could be something that's sinful, but it just depends on what the situation is. Proverbs 14:29 is the only one I want to bring up. You can bring one up if you want to, about anger being sinful, at least uncontrolled anger. It says in Proverbs 14:29, he who is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who is quick-tempered exacts folly. And so the Bible explicitly says, over and over again, not controlling your anger is going to bring only but misery and sorrow in your life. And so we need to be able to control that anger. And this episode has a lot of it's personal to me because I deal with this myself. Anger is probably one of my top struggles. I have several. I'm just I'm a basket case, but I have so many things I deal with, and this is one of the big ones. And so, say, well, you're a preacher, you're supposed to be perfect. Well, I'll be the first to tell you I'm far from it and never will be until I reach glory. So, this is something that's personal for me. So if you're out there listening, you're not alone. And we need Jesus. I know that sounds cliche to say. I know that's like too easy of an answer, but we need help from him. And so we need his scriptures to tell us how to deal with it. And so we're going to look at 3 things I think that help me with my anger. And if you like doing sermon outlines, I like to rhyme sometimes. The first point is confession. The second point is concession. And then the last point is repression versus expression. And I'll elaborate on those as we continue. And so let's start with confessing. If you have an anger problem, you may not really realize it. I know it took me a long time to actually realize, oh, wait, I have a problem with this. I'm actually sinning. Dealing with anger starts with admitting that we have an anger problem. Drew, do you mind reading Proverbs chapter 28 and verse 13 for us?
Not a bit. And in fact, in Proverbs 28:13, it says, he who conceals his transgressions will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes them will find compassion. And I was thinking, Luke, while you were talking, of another text in James 1, it says something similar. It's not a prospering attribute. In James 1:19, he beckons that we be quick to hear, slow to speak, and then it says, and be slow to anger. Mm-hmm. And it goes on to say in 1:20 of James, the reason for this is that the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness or the quality, the attribute of God. Who God is not going to be achieved by us being angry at things. And like we've already pointed out, our anger is going to need to be, there's a sense in which sometimes it's justified and it's appropriate. That's where we're going to have to try to find that balance. So thinking about then why James is saying this, that the anger of man doesn't produce or achieve the righteousness of God. In Isaiah 55, it will insist, Isaiah 55:10 and 11, that God's method would achieve this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so I'm thinking of, if like here in Proverbs 28:13, James 1:20, if we want to actually produce or prosper, anger is not going to be the route by which that happens.
Mm-hmm, for sure. Yeah. And we have to tell God, hey, I have this problem. It helps. And it helps for yourself too, to realize that. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's one of the first steps of addiction, getting out of addiction, is like confessing you have a problem, admit it, because that's the first step. And so when we confess it, though, we have to realize it's our problem and not someone else's. I've done this in my life several times. I hope I won't do it again, but I have a tendency sometimes to blame it on someone else. A lot of these issues that we have with anger or anxiety, it comes from learned behavior a lot of times. It's something we learn from maybe our parents or our grandparents or someone who raised us. But at some point when we get old enough, we have to take responsibility and say, this is not their problem. Although they had something to do with it, I have to take that problem now and deal with it myself. It's not their fault completely. Yes, they're at fault. God will, take care of that. But we have to actually do something about it. And we have to say, hey, I'm taking this and I'm doing something wrong with it. I need to turn around and have responsibility for it. You think about Genesis chapter 3 with Adam and Eve. When they sinned, Adam was like, hey, it's the woman. She did it. She made me do it. And then Eve turns around and says, no, the serpent made me do it. It's kind of interesting. If I'm not mistaken, I may have to read it again, but I don't think the serpent really blames it on anybody else. He's the only one that's taking responsibility for his actions, not to, glorify the devil in any sense. But we've got to be able to take responsibility and say, this is my fault. I could blame things like my ADHD that I have. I could blame it on this. I could blame my ADHD even for anger. One of the effects of ADHD is dealing with emotions in a bad way. It's hard to control impulses. And I could say, well, I just have this mental problem, so I'm out. I'm good. But God looks at me and says, no, you've got to take that problem and work it out. Now, obviously, he's going to help, but I've got to take responsibility. Because all of us are told in 2 Corinthians 5:10 that we all must appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one of us may be recompensed for his deeds in the body, according to what he has done, whether good or bad. So we got to be responsible.
Yeah, that's an echo back. 2 Corinthians 5 is an echo back to Psalm 62, which is one of several texts in the Psalms that talks about God judging according to one's deeds or the works that's been done by somebody in the human experience. And in Psalm 9:8, this is echoed by Acts 17:30 and 31, where he says he will judge the world in righteousness or fairness or equity. And the point that I'm aiming at then is this: we have a God who is able to make a judgment while weighing all of the variables perfectly.
Yeah.
And so he knows, the difference between, let's say, an individual who's mentally handicapped and an individual who's perfectly responsible mentally.
Sure.
And God's able to weigh all of these different variables. And so when he looks at Drew Leonard, he looks at Drew Leonard as far as his experiences, his education, all of these other variables play in as to God's making a judgment on who we are. I would never dare at this moment to expect my 3-year-old boy to master calculus.
Yeah.
But if he were 18, that might be a different story. And so thinking about how God is able to look at different human individuals, he's able to make perfect, fair, equal judgments while weighing those variables appropriately. And so when thinking about our anger, if that's our struggle, God's able to know exactly how responsible we are
Sure.
and whether or not we're owning up to that.
Yeah, God's always the righteous judge. And that's something comforting because you see people out there doing things. And my wife has taught me this. When people are having, or they're dealing with something, or maybe they're just portraying some terrible tempers or something, she always reminds me, well, maybe they have an actual issue. Maybe they can't help it. And it's taught me to maybe think about that first before making a judgment. And obviously God's going to be the judge of all that. So as we think about confessing it, not only as something we have a problem with, but it's also our problem that we have to deal with, the next thing we have to do then is concede. We need to be able to submit, in other words, to God. And the text that I want to bring up is James chapter 4 and verses 7 and 8. I know this seems, again, these verses almost sound too simple when you read them, but it is simple. It starts with submitting to God because we're not going to be able to handle it. I talked to a very good therapist once in dealing with anger, and she told me, talking to me is great. And I recommend it. You need help, but put God first in this. Make sure you're telling him your needs because he's going to help. And in James chapter 4, verses 7 through 8, James writes this: submit, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. And we see, therefore, the famous saying, what's it there for? If you back up to verse 6, it says he gives a greater grace. Therefore, it says God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. God doesn't want us, when dealing with anger, to say, well, I don't need God's help. I can handle this on my own. God wants us to submit to him. And it says then to resist the devil and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, verse 8 says, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. I think about Satan as 1 Peter 5 and verse 8 says, that he's walking about looking for someone to bully. That's what he's doing. I think about Job. He appeared before God. He was wanting to pick on somebody. And that's what he's doing with us, especially Christians. You think, well, once I'm a Christian, he's not going to bully me. Well, it's probably going to get worse as time goes by. Before we get into this, we got to remember 1 Corinthians 10:13. And being enticed to sin, God's not going to let Satan tempt us with something we can't handle. So we can handle this. But we've got to start with submitting to God. and resisting Satan. I heard a really good lesson on this a while back on James 4. It wasn't about anger, but the application was made very beautifully, I thought. He said, why does it say submit to God and resist the devil? Well, we first of all talked about that's a continual action verb. You got to keep on resisting. It's not like you're going to resist him one time and, well, he's going to leave you alone. No, you got to keep on doing it sometimes. And eventually he's going to flee from you. And why would he flee from you? And the guy said this, when pressure only brings us closer to God, what's the point? I mean, Satan looks at us and says, well, I can't do anything with them. I'm trying to wreck their life. And no matter what I do, they only get closer to God. What's the point of doing this? And that gives me comfort in seeing this verse to know that Satan will eventually give up. He will. And he may come back every now and then, but he knows better at some point.
Yeah. You brought up 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. There is no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. God's faithful, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting that in 10:12, he prefaces that with saying, wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall.
Mm-hmm.
And I think going back to our first point, which was the idea of confessing or admitting, there's an honesty that's required there to say this is an actual problem, because until that happens, we're not going to make the necessary steps of progress or transformation. And so a lot of times what happens is our pride overwhelms us. And in the same context there in James 4, he's insisting that we be humble.
Mm-hmm.
Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. He will exalt you. And so when we start to think that we can even master these things on our own, we don't admit that they're problems if we go that far with it. This is just complicating the problem of anger further. And we really need to turn it over to God. Now, it looks like we're going to talk about what that looks like.
Yes.
What shape does this take? If we're going to turn it over to God, what might that look like?
Yeah, for sure. You don't just say, hey, God, it's your problem and go away with it. There's obviously some steps that we got to take. So, yeah, it starts again with confessing. Then it starts with conceding, giving it up to God. And then what that looks like, I'm going to talk about now repression versus expression. Repression is holding something in, not releasing it, trying to bottle it all up. That's another way of saying it, bottling up your emotions. We'll see in just a moment that that's unhealthy. Expression is dealing with it, getting it out somehow, expressing, kind of like an artist, how they express their emotions through art or whatever it may be. We've got to be able to get that out somehow. Usually uncontrolled anger, from what I've studied and looking at psychology and things like that, I'm just an expert on all of this. Just kidding. Most people say it starts with stress. Anger doesn't just come out of nowhere. Sometimes there's some sort of stress, and then that leads to anxiety, which is the reaction to stress. Because let's just admit, stress is never going to go away. We're always going to have stress in our life. And then anxiety is that reaction to stress, which then leads to anger, which most of the time, if we're not careful, will lead to sin. And I think the ideal plan of all of this would be eliminate stress, right? I wished we could just eliminate unplanned bills or hospital bills or the death of a loved one. That would be great, but that's unrealistic. And then we wished we could just eliminate anxiety, and I think there are ways we can eliminate that. Maybe you need medicine for it. God can help with that. But there are those times when there's that anxiety coming. You're stressed over something. Maybe it's a loved one stressing you out, or maybe it's a child stressing you out, or a job. And that feeling you get of emotion, what do you do with that? Where do you put it? What about the times that anxiety turns into anger? Now, some of us, like me, we have a harder time dealing with our anger than others. A lot of people, it's not this boiling feeling. It's just kind of like, well, that's annoying, and they get over it. But for me, it's like and you can't see it, but it's like, it's about to be World War II in my emotions. And so we've got to think about practical ways to deal with it. I want to start with what not to do. It is severely unhealthy to repress anger. I've read studies that show bottling up those emotions not only makes our mental health worse, but it can also make our physical health worse. I know a lot of people, I've heard of a lot of people anyways. I know actually a very dear friend, he's a lot older than me, who kind of internalizes things and doesn't really tell people about things that he's stressed about I'm not mistaken, is that what happened to Robin Williams? He kind of really didn't get out his depression problem. That's what I heard. I don't know whether or not that's true, but we know from studies, bottling all that up and not dealing with it in some way affects everything else. It affects your body. And honestly, if you don't get it out in some way, it's going to explode even worse. Like I think about a bottle, you shake it up and then you give it to your friend and prank them, if you open it up slowly, it's going to come out very slowly. It's not going to make a mess everywhere. But if you just pop it open, eventually it's going to explode. And our anger has to do that. It has to go somewhere. Now, where it can't go is to our children, our spouses, our extended family, and our friends. I know that's easy to do because, for instance, a spouse is someone we let our guard down around. Everybody else, like I may not lose it around you. I may not lose it around Wesley or Eddie or one of the instructors here. Of course, if they pressed me hard enough in preaching school, I might have, but I'm just kidding. But with a spouse or someone really close to us, we let our guard down, and it can be really easy to take that out on them if we're not careful. And so we have got to do something with that anger.
Yeah. And I don't know if you would like to go first or I could go first, but I've got a list of things, and I think you've got a list of things that maybe we found practical that will help us. And
go first. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Certainly. So I would suggest, at least I thought when you first asked me to be on the program, I thought, well, how would we cope with some of these things? And I put down 3 thoughts that I think would be primary, at least for me, to keep in focus. The first one, and these are not in an order. I wish I could give them all 3 to you simultaneously at one time and you just take them all as they sit together. But the first one I would say is we need to reorient what makes us angry. And that's very closely knit with a study of the Bible. We need to have whatever God's revelation is insisting on as being our primary focus or function. And so that sends me to this thought of, and this was back earlier in our program where we were talking about, is God ever angry? And the answer is yes. Mm-hmm. Are there justifiable cases of anger? And the answer is yes. So if that's true, and I'm trying to be motivated by God's revelation, the reading of the text of the Bible, I want to be thinking, well, what made God angry? Mm-hmm. And in Isaiah chapter 54 and verse 8, there's a very interesting passage that speaks of God's anger, but it tells us that it's only momentary. It's not something that's perpetually with God. He's not going around like some sadistic being constantly foaming at the mouth.
Sure.
And so in Isaiah 54:8, it says, in an outburst of anger, I hid my face from you for a moment, speaking about the Babylonian exile. But with everlasting loving kindness, I will have compassion on you, says the Lord your Redeemer. This lets us know that this was an outburst of God's anger. Now, we're not talking about, but I would just assert the point, that this is obviously justifiable. This is God's anger, so we know it's right. We know it's in character with his holiness, his justice, his mercy, his compassion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when I think about how this would help me practically, I need to make sure that I'm putting into my life the kind of influences that would help me make my anger more appropriate. Mm-hmm. And that's what God is more or less saying. If his anger is a reflex and it's not integral to who he is as a person, I too need to realize that my anger should only be a reflex and it should not be something that's integral to me as a person. God is loving, God is holy, et cetera, et cetera. That's different from a reflex of his anger. And so thinking about that, then I also remind myself that every time Jesus Christ is angry in the Gospels, it's because of hard hearts. In fact, in Mark chapter 3 and verses 1-6, there's this episode where Jesus himself gets angry, but the text is clearly noting why that is. It says in 3:5, he was grieved at their hardness of heart, and therefore he was angry. 3:5, looking around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart. And so Jesus was right to be angry. God is right to be angry. But then thinking about how that helps me, if I start to have influences that reshape who I am and what's really important in my life, then like Abraham Heschel, a Jew, said rightly of God, he said, that which generates God's wrath or anger was always something that was counter to his love in the first place. And the only time I should ever be angry then is when it's something that drives against God's greater character, purpose, or love. The second thing I put down would be stay busy. And of course, that's closely knit to the text, but also there would be other ways, recreational ways perhaps, that we could stay busy and try to keep ourselves focused on what's more important. Some of the times that I've found to be the biggest struggles are when we are, and God forbid, we say, oh, I'm bored, or I'm idle. And I think we've all heard the saying that idle hands are the devil's workshop. So staying busy would also maybe help us reorient our anger. And then the third thing I put down is self-reflect. I don't know how it is with everybody, but generally I've found that anger is our assessment of one of two things, either others or circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if we were to self-reflect and stop looking so much at other people, we won't be angry with other people, and stop worrying so much about what I would consider to be circumstances. And sometimes we might just go ahead and refocus our attention onto ourselves and think about how we are developing. That's not to make some of this easier. It's just a fact.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm thinking if you were to tell me today that, my wife came down with cancer, or that if one of the kids got killed in a car wreck or something real tragic, I'm not sure exactly what kind of emotions I might have. There's a good probability that anger would be among them. And who would I be angry at, though? I would certainly not like the circumstance, and that'd be justifiable to some extent. But part of the problem is that we get so focused on if it's circumstances instead of focusing on how we ought to be in handling these really serious circumstances. And I think if we always self-reflect and think about how we need to handle ourselves rather than looking at the circumstance or another person, for sure, it's going to help us reshape.
For sure. Very good.
Those are things that I've found, Luke, that helped me.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. I appreciate that. Jill, I have some of the things that you said. I want to touch back on the for some reason, my brain has just died. Where does it say evil companionship corrupts good morals?
1 Corinthians 15:30.
There it is. Yes. Okay. I knew it was in 1 Corinthians. Not the expert here in memory, apparently. But it says in verse number, as he just said, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, some translations say evil companionship corrupts good morals. My translation says bad company corrupts good morals. Not talking about the band, talking about people. And I'm if I'm not mistaken, there's a psalm in Psalm 119. He says, "I'm a companion to those that keep your precepts, to those that fear your name." I'm probably not wording that exactly, but like as Drew just said, just touching on that, is surround yourself with people who don't make you angry if you can. But back to what, the things I have, as far as like spiritual help, there are things that we can do spiritually, and there are also things that we can do physically. For spiritual help, Kimberly and I, she doesn't deal with anger. I do. But we both start and end each day with the Psalms. We read one, and I'll talk about meditation in just a moment, but we meditate on that afterwards. We actually sit there and actually like literally meditate and think about it, because the Psalms are full of emotion. I mean, it's an emotional book. It's all about God. Why? Why are you waiting to do this? My enemies are doing this to me. They're making me so mad. You have you forgotten me? Why aren't you listening to me? But then we see as he's pouring all of that emotion out to God, and I'll talk about prayer in just a moment, but we see him pouring all of that out to God. But it's then that usually at the end of those Psalms, like for example, Psalm 22, where he says, and obviously we know about Christ and what that means for him, but just in that Psalm by itself, he thinks God's abandoned him. He thinks God's not there, but we read the Psalm and later on, God is there. He does realize God hasn't forgotten him, but we just see the Psalms and they kind of help us realize, hey, here's an inspired man going through all of these emotions, and they help us realize that God's there for us. And that takes us to prayer. The Psalms are mainly prayer. A lot of them are just prayers that David has. Prayer is so important. I know we say that a lot, and we don't take that seriously a lot of times in our life, but we need prayer so bad. Just not trying to get all charismatic here or whatever, but I've had moments where I'm really dealing with something. I mean, it's like I'm about to to go crazy, and I've learned prayer. I don't know what happens. I can't, I'm not going to get Pentecostal here. I don't know exactly what happens, but I do know something happens when we get on our knees and pray to God through an emotion, whatever it may be. And I think about Mark 1:35. I want to read that one because this is how Jesus started his day. And I mean, if he's God in the flesh, then we should probably take advice from him and do what he did. And he dealt with anger. He was about, in this context of Mark chapter 1, he was about to go heal people. He was about to go preach to people. It says in verse 45, but he went out and began to proclaim it freely, to spread the news around to such an extent. Now here's some stress, that Jesus could no longer publicly enter a city, but stayed out in unpopulated areas, and they were coming to him from everywhere. Now I know he loved and had compassion for people, but I would say there were times he got peopled out, as me and Kimberly like to call it. There's just so many things going on, so much stress. Well, then how did Jesus start his day? And it's in Mark 1:35, where it says, in the early morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went away to a secluded place and was praying there. He was talking to God, and you could argue, well, wasn't he talking to himself since he's God? Well, no, he wasn't. He was talking to God the Father, teaching us that we need to pray to God. And I think about this too. God, in a sense, did talk to himself. We think, oh, is he crazy? No. We have this thing within ourselves, this, I don't know how to explain it, but we talk to ourselves. You know, there's a side of me that's really worried about something. There's another side of me that says, hey, it's fine. You know, stop. You know, and then there's another side of me that says, stop talking to yourself. Stop talking to yourself. You know, but that's how God dealt with things. He, in a sense, talked to himself. But more than that, we need to talk to God. We need to tell God about it. We need to, and I don't think we should be afraid to tell him that we're upset with him. I don't think we should be afraid to ask him why. Why am I dealing with this? Why am I so mad? Why are you not doing anything about it? That's okay. You know, we've got to end up trusting in him, but he knows those feelings already. He knows you're angry. So prayer is really important. And there's another thing I want to talk about with spiritual help, and that's meditation. We often go to Ephesians 4:26, and rightly so, because it says, be angry and do not sin. But that's an echo of Psalm chapter 4 and verse 4. And it's amazing the prescription we're told when dealing with anger. Because Psalm 4 and verse 4, Paul only quotes a part of that. He says, tremble or be angry and do not sin. So again, there's a commandment to be angry, be maybe in a sense, in a healthy way, be anxious over something, whatever it may be. That word, I guess, has some different meanings, but mainly anger. Be angry and do not sin. And here's the next phrase: meditate in your heart upon your bed and be still. Now, I had never seen this verse before like I've seen it now, but this is inspired scripture telling us that meditation is good for mental health.
Yeah. And especially then in the Bible, when it talks about meditation, you'll usually find it coupled up with the principles or the precepts of God.
Sure.
It's the idea of even reflection.
Yeah.
It's not just bald thinking with nothing going through your brain. You know, there's something driving this.
That's why me and Kimberly usually start with a psalm or something. So we have something to think about. And another way to do it too, I would always encourage you to meditate on God. In fact, there were times David didn't just meditate on his precepts. It says he meditated on his works. You know, you think about, hey, I'm angry right now, but hey, God's doing this for me. He's done that for me. You know, you think about things God has done. And I've also read deep breathing is good. Just focusing on your breath, because it kind of gets you calmed down. And so those are the spiritual things that help me. And if you want to know how to meditate, you know, I'm not an expert on it. You may have to reach out to a professional for that. But I do know meditation music helps me, something to kind of distract my mind a little bit from getting too distracted from other things, which almost sounds counterintuitive, but it does help. And I think about physical help. You know, as Drew was mentioning, staying busy. I know this is silly, but one of the things that helps me a lot, not all the time, but many times, is a stress ball. I don't know if you know what those are, if you've ever seen one, but it's something to squeeze. Yeah. I was seeing a therapist once. I'm just a wreck. And she told me, take your anger out on something. You can't repress it. You can't hold it in. You can't take it out on your wife. You can't take it out on your children or whatever it may be. You need to take it out on something. And she recommended different things. She recommended maybe a punching bag, maybe out in the garage. If I really feel like I'm just go out there and release it. She recommended a stress ball. I've learned that actually does help. Now, I'm not saying it helps every time, because there's times it doesn't, but For instance, I was on a phone call or texting a very dear loved one over the Bible, trying to convert them. And they were saying things to me that was just driving me crazy. I mean, it was making me so mad. And I really felt like if that wall right there, I'm going to punch a hole in that wall. I'm just so angry. And instead, I listened to my therapist, went and squeezed the life out of this little stress man I had. And all of a sudden, the anger turned to tears. It turned into crying, which is okay. Some people say, well, how does that work? I actually had an elder hear me say that, and he went to a psychologist in the congregation and asked the psychologist to explain how that happens or why that's a thing. And he told him, it's just how emotions work. It turns from bad to good. And that really helped me, having something to put my anger at instead of, let's say, my wife or my child that's on the way. I shouldn't do that. I should put it somewhere. And I would say probably do that in private. Don't go crazy in front of people if you can help it. And another thing that helps me, and you may not be a musician, I know, Drew, you are, guitar really helps me. If I'm angry, if I'm stressed over something, I just sit down and I play for a little while, and it kind of helps me.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because in 1 Samuel 16, Saul has this, what's called an evil spirit.
Yes.
I think if we had seen something like that, it would have been something like depression or anger. It looks very clear like he's angry because it ends up at one point, he ends up throwing the spear at David twice, really, to try to kill him. And I think it's very interesting that it says that when he calls for David, the musician, the quote unquote evil spirit would depart from him, whether it's distraction or it's a removal of whatever's generating the anger in the first place. Somehow that affected Saul in a positive way.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, that I don't know what it is, but it helps me a lot. It's like I said, the stress ball thing sometimes works. Sometimes I have to go to the guitar and I play. Maybe you play piano. I would encourage you to learn an instrument. I mean, you don't have to be a Beethoven. Playing Mary Had a Little Lamb might help you get through it. And that actually helps me too, is doing something kind of funny. I know that sounds weird, but like me and my wife, anytime I'm starting to deal with something, I make a funny noise or I say something silly. And that helps a little bit too. I say some funny word like giblet, and for some reason that makes me feel better. Maybe not all the time, but anyways, another thing that helps me, and this is probably the best, is intense. I don't mean walking around the park. I mean intense exercise. The Bible does say that bodily exercise profits. It says it's little. I mean, compared to godly exercise, it's doesn't even stand in comparison. But in 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 8, we're told that bodily exercise does profit little. And I'm turning there, but I don't need to really read it because I just read to you what it basically says. This is actually scientifically proven that when you exercise, I'm reading this from an article, your brain is intensely focused. You're distracted. Whatever it is that's bothering you, whether it's a coworker or your job, or maybe you're having a Bible study, someone that's driving you insane, whatever it may be, exercise distracts you. And what happens is your heart rate increases. You start experiencing shorter breath. Your body naturally works to slow your breath to a normal pace following exercise. And so what this is some sort of physiological response, which is similar to the response needed to calm down when you're feeling angry. And I've experienced this. I've been dealing with things before. I go to the gym, which mine's Planet Fitness. It doesn't have to be that for you. It could be anywhere. You could buy exercise bands. I have those too for backup. I have a great place to run outside if I need to. Getting that out through exercise really helps. It calms you down. I'm sure, I think you exercise too sometimes.
Tried to. I had a leg injury went back last year at camp. So it's been a struggle this last year.
Yes.
I used to, for sure. And I try to do a little bit still.
I did too. I have a IT band strain, and I've kind of given up on running. I wished I could do it more, but I'm like, no, I'm not going to kill myself. But some sort of exercise, whether it's, upper body, lower body, any of those things can help. And the Bible, I think, doesn't necessarily say we should do those things very explicitly, but I think it's implied, because if it says be angry and do not sin, then you need to do whatever it takes not to sin in a healthy manner. So I think it's implied, if anything.
Yeah. And just the idea, again, self-control is multifaceted, thinking about how it's not just a mental exercise. being self-controlled in body and just keeping everything in check and trying to run that through the filter of God's word, which will keep us where we need to be.
For sure. Yeah. So these are things that help us, and I hope they help you. If you think of something else that can help, hey, send me an email. You'll hear the email here in a little bit where you can reach me. Because I, as I said in the beginning of this is something I deal with even currently that I'm trying to work on. And we have to remember this: God is going to help us. If it is going to send us to hell by not controlling our anger, and God doesn't want anyone to go to hell, then he's going to help us. If we submit to him and do the things that we're told to do, he's not going to let us down as long as we trust in him. And there may be challenges to make us doubt him, and we've got to keep on trying. And so, Drew, I really thank you for helping me today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Luke.
It's been an honor to have you on the podcast. It's around 40 minutes, so I think we did pretty good. But that's it for today, and hopefully we'll see you in the next episode. Hey guys, thanks for listening to this episode of a Study in Truth podcast. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us on social media, or you can reach us at astudyintruth92@gmail.com. And don't forget to rate our show.